Pathfinder the Adventure card game. You're thinking about jumping in, but the question is, second edition core and adventure path that's just been released, or do you focus on the previous version, the first edition, where there are a number of not only adventure paths like Rise of the Rune Lords and Mummy's Mask, but also numerous character packs, numerous expansions, really a tremendous amount of content to explore that could keep you busy for a long time. Or maybe you're like me, a Pathfinder Adventure card game enthusiast, lots and lots of wonderful hours playing this system, getting that role-playing RPG experience in a card format. Do we jump to second edition? What are the differences? That's what we're going to focus on here, not so much from a rules perspective, because there's a lot of videos out there discussing the rules and showing the rules mechanic. I've explored that in some previous podcasts that I pushed up to the channel here under the board gaming playlist. I'm interested right now on the narrative. How does the game present itself? Does it really feel like a role-playing game? Which one immerses you better? And the changes, because they do use the same core AI mechanic, the changes in second edition, are they true changes and upgrades, or like many companies like to do, changes for the sake of changes to get you to change and buy into a new system? So the first big change is the artwork. The previous versions, the artwork was kind of generic. It was bland. It was just really to kind of convey what was going on with the card. Certainly it was functional. After a while, I have to say, you just get used to it and it presents itself. The artwork has been upgraded now in the core and the second edition. It's more presentable. It's a little bit darker in terms of the inks that are used, but I do find that it helps to evoke that the feeling of the game, the feeling of your characters, the feeling of the monsters, the feeling of the locations. So for me, that's a big plus. I mean, it is a card. It's not a ton of artwork. It's not huge and expansive, but it's enough that when you flip it over, it helps pull you in and draws you in. So for me, that was a big, big plus on there. The other change, the really big change, and for me, this is the kind of really the deal breaker in it. Now you have a quest book where as you move through the adventure path, there's 2 pages of text that sets up the reason why you're going into this adventure. It ties into the locations and it helps introduce a storyline. Now in the previous first edition, starting with Rise of the Rune Lords, there was a story. There was a story, but it wasn't well conveyed. The cards were a little bit generic. You kind of got an idea of what was going on. Now, if you played Pathfinder Tabletop and you played that adventure, you knew what was going on. What we saw was a number of fan-created content, literally adventure books, to go with the previous editions. So for me, that alone is a tremendous help, both in pulling the players in pulling you in, and really setting the stage as a dungeon master, as a game master, opening this book, reading it. Okay, this is the quest. Here's where we're going. This is what we're doing. It helps to tie it in much better than cards could do on there. The other upgrade, items. Now, a quest game, of course, is all about items, magic items, loot, weapons. What we saw in the previous sets early on, there was a lot of generic kind of junk items, filler items on there, stuff that wasn't that interesting. And the idea was, of course, well, you're just starting out. You're literally level 1. You're level 0. And you have level 1 cards in there. And as you go through the adventure path, you add more and more cards. So as you go to level 2, level 3, level 4, more interesting cards are added in. So you're going to grow, you're going to expand. And that worked. But I like the idea now in the new second edition core, there are really no junk items. All of the items are interesting. All of the items are unique. They have some really nice powers. They've been scaled appropriately for this level 0, level 1. They're not overly powerful at all. It's just starting out. But what I like is This idea of the grind is there in the game. You're going to go through the adventure path. You're going to visit stuff. You're going to gain items. But right away from level 1, early on, you've got some interesting stuff. It's not like the first set of adventures, and I loved Rise of the Rune Lords, but the first set of adventures was just kind of taking you through the motions, and the gear wasn't that great. It's almost like, well, let's just skip it and go to the first adventure path rather than this foundation one. Second edition right away does that. You're in. It works. What doesn't work? And this, I have to say, this is a matter of opinion. This is a matter of opinion. So take that for what it's worth. What we have now in the second edition is an introduction of effects, meaning you can be dazed, you can be stunned, and your character then has some penalties or has some abilities they can't move from different locations, and you track that for a turn or two. I understand where they were going with it from a role-playing perspective. It introduces more effects. So rather than just having to check dice, success or fail, up against certain encounters, it's not only success or fail, but you have to deal with the effects that it's creating. And that makes sense. That makes total sense when going up against certain traps, when going up against certain encounters, visiting certain locations. It is going to affect your character. Poison would be a great example. But the implementation of the game, it slows it down a little bit because now you have to track something. And it's not overly hard. But in a game where you're flipping cards and going through an adventure at a pretty quick pace, that's the selling point. Takes you through an adventure, essentially takes you through an adventure, a role-playing game adventure that would be 4 or 5 hours. This does in about an hour on there. And that very streamlining mechanic of it, the effects kind of get in the way a little bit. You have to remember it. You have to track it. I find it pulls me out of the adventure a little bit. I'm not saying that's good. I'm not saying that's bad. I don't think that was a necessary change from the first edition to the second edition. Okay, you're thinking about jumping in. Do you go with first edition or second edition? I would say, given the changes and the future longevity of now second edition, I would say jump into second edition. Certainly if you could get a great deal on Rise of the Rune Lords or trade for another set and play that through, absolutely. But retail, going in and buying the older stuff at this point, the second edition is superior, and it's now going to be continued pushing forward. There's also something to be said, and this is true of any living type card game, because this is a living card game. When you get in at the beginning of the cycle, when you get in at the beginning of the ground floor, it's much easier to maintain sanity over your collection, and it's much easier to keep growing your collection bit by bit than, say, if you were jumping in a year or two from now and there's a lot more material out there. It becomes a little bit more challenging. So this is a great time to jump into the second edition. If you have a lot of stuff for first edition and you can play it and replay it, it doesn't invalidate it. But I would still say, yes, jump into second edition, because if you really loved first and you love the content out there, it's just going to be a natural extension to jump into the second edition on there and push that forward in your gaming collection.